Hello dear viewer! Wow, this video has been a long time coming, though I feel like I should explain something about it first. Firstly, I have made the decision to split this video in two parts. Considering how much of it relies on copyrighted material, it would drive me insane if I had to constantly re-edit and re-upload the same hour-long video every time it gets blocked, so I decided to cut it in half. This way you can get half a video now, instead of waiting God knows how long for me to find the time and energy to finish it, while also making it easier for me to control damage dealt by copyright holders. Secondly, I do realize that by making this video I am ultimately connecting my channel to the topic of anime culture in Poland, and while it is something that I could potentially avoid by releasing this video just a little later, a few bad things have happened in my life that had me begging for some kind of distraction. This video is still a product of passion, much like the first one, but also a necessary occupation for a tired mind. I am putting this out there simply so we don't assume this channel is turning into an anime-oriented channel. This is a follow-up to a previous video on a similar topic, and I am currently not intending on making more videos of a similar theme. Cut to 2023 when The Right Opinion releases a 3-hour-long video detailing my descent into an anime rabbit hole, even though it could be summed up in 15 minutes. I don't really hate The Right Opinion. I respect his work, but you know, this is something that's likely to happen if I eventually take off. So yeah, with that little bit of explanation out of the way, let us begin. On the 5th of February 2021, I uploaded my first high-effort video on this channel. It was an explanation of what a lector is, or why Polish dubbing for old anime was so weird. This video currently holds over 1200 views and is the most viewed video on my channel. This script was originally written in early December 2021, this is currently my third most viewed video. However, with this video I left a few things unclear. At the end I quickly mentioned that the attitude of Polish audiences towards anime plays a part in its localization, and I did not elaborate on it at all. And while I did kind of mention that the political and economic situation in Poland at the time was part of a reason for the low quality of these localizations, that was barely an explanation. It might not be a surprise at this point, but I grew up in Poland, and for a part of my life, I identified as a full-fledged otaku. So I have a bit of experience with this incredibly specific community.
Was that a stone?
So with a combination of personal experience, as well as second-hand knowledge, I'm going to go deep into this topic and explain the various factors which influenced how the common Polak perceives anime today, and how it plays a role in the development of the anime community in Poland. Fasten your seatbelts, we're going on a journey. In order to understand how anime was and is perceived by the Polish audience, we have to look at it from the perspective of a Polish viewer, and to do that, we will begin with a little history on how animation developed as a medium there. For the most part, the most well-known and influential animation studio in Poland has been the Animated Film Studio in Bielsko-Biała. They were first established in 1947 and went through several transformations throughout their history as the status of a nationalized institute changed over the years. Originally it was established as an experimental animation studio, operating under the redaction of a workers' tribune, constantly changing its headquarters and the nature of its operation. Their first finished project came all the way in 1948. Czy to był sen, loosely translated as "was the dream", has been described as an artistic attempt at coping with the horrors of the Holocaust. I'm saying it's merely being described like that because doing research on this topic is extremely difficult. There are hardly any sources confirming the existence of the film, little to no frames from it, and for all intents and purposes, it can be considered lost media, as there are no existing copies. From this, and a few other examples, we can easily deduce that the studio's earliest projects were purely artistic and aimed at adults. However, the fellow Poles in my audience will know that this isn't what the studio became most known for. In 1953, the studio had its first real breakthrough, with a release of a short-length animated movie, Koziołeczek, or Little Goat. The movie was presented at Karlowe Vary, where it received the first award for an animated film, as well as an honorary award from the judges in Venice. It was the first Polish animation to win an award presented by an international council, and this had sealed the legacy of the studio. From this point on, it will gain renown and fame for producing exclusively child-friendly animations. Around that time, the studio also provided cheap labor for foreign productions, especially those made by Hanna-Barbera. Certain seasons of the Flintstones are credited as a product of the animated miniature studio in Bielsko-Biała. I would like you to mentally leave a bookmark at this little bit of trivia, as we will return to it later. Throughout the 60s all the way till today, the SFR studio has been busy producing children's cartoons. Many, if not all of them, became beloved classics and are still proudly revisited today. If you have friends at work or college who are Polish immigrants, they might be able to tell you of the cartoons they used to watch, and so will their parents and grandparents. The names of these shows are well known: Bolek and Lolek, Lekcio, Adventures of the Waffle Dragon, and Pampolini the Animal Hunter. Some might mention them along with cartoons made in Czechoslovakia or the USSR, as those were also aired in Poland and gained a sizable fandom there, but cartoons made in Poland always stood out, as they had a very distinct feel to them. Since talking at length about each of these cartoons would take forever, I suggest we leave it for another future video. Instead, I will describe the general feel of these shows. They were very innocent, witty, quaint, simplistic in their style and technique, though not cheap-looking. Many of them can be found on YouTube, and I highly suggest you look them up to get an idea of what children's media was like at the time. The studio also had a fair share of full-length movies, some of which were extended episodes of their most popular cartoons, and others were completely original tales. Even after the fall of socialism and messy privatization, the studio was hard at work constantly. Their most distinct work came in 2009 with The Star of Copernicus.
Już ja wam obliczę taki horoskop, że nawet burmistrz was nie obroni.
Their first full-length movie to be animated with the aid of a computer, as opposed to traditional cell animation.
Poznasz ją po jej obliczu!
Jak?
But, by this point, some of you might have started to notice a certain pattern. All of these are kids' animations. Was there any room left for adult animation at any point? And this question makes this history so much more complicated and more depressing. While there were animations made for adults specifically all the way through the 70s and 80s, they weren't big efforts made by well-known studios. More often than not, they were made independently by a single artist, aired once on a culture-based channel, or aired during some sort of an underground festival, and never shown to the world again. And unless you were an artsy hipster, which you most likely weren't because socialism does not leave much room for art, you wouldn't be aware of their existence in the first place. The existence of adult animation in the sidelines and away from the mainstream had an impact on how animation was perceived in general. Animation became defined as a medium for children, and exclusively for children. And any exception was exactly that, an exception made by someone with too much time on their hands. This remained the status quo up until the late 2000s, when American influence would finally be felt in the Polish show business.
Shut up, silly woman!
Any fan of animation will tell you that South Park, while a decent show on its own, had a tremendously negative impact on the industry as a whole, as suddenly a whole lot of amateur studios thought that they could become big by putting little effort into an ugly animation style, and that stuffing the script with swears and references to drugs, alcohol, and sex is all you need to become successful.
Yeah, whatever, you fat bitch. What did you say? I said I have a bad itch. Oh!
And the worst part is, some of them succeeded. It was no different in the realm of Polish animation. In 2004, an animator by the name of Bartosz Wałaszek established his studio known as Git Productions, currently Spinka Film Studio. His animations were characterized by very poor animation quality, cheap and vulgar jokes, the punchline most often being something along the lines of, "The funny-looking character said a bad word," or, "The innocent and cute-looking animal took a shit." This studio is still running, still making money, not improving in quality very much, and still making me disappointed in the state of the world.
A pomidory, jakie to nasze? Sklepowe.
Jesus Christ. Just look at this.
Woda motywuje mnie do podjęcia pracy.
And yes, it is all voiced by the same guy. No, this isn't some twist on the concept of a lector. This is just one guy doing all the voice acting because effort is overrated.
Nie przerywaj!
You thought The Legends of Chamberlain High was low effort? Somebody call Mr. Enter, we were about to give him a fucking stroke. There are many more offenders akin to Git Productions, but they were here for the longest time, and they always did it the worst. I will not go too much into the sins of the Polish animation industry, because I think I made my point by now. In the modern age, there are three distinct classes of animation in Poland. 1. Completely sanitized and innocent animations for children. 2. Weird, artsy projects which you're not likely to see more than once in your life, unless you go out of your way to find them. And 3. Low-effort attempts at copying South Park and Family Guy, resulting in making me suicidal. And now that I have provided you with some perspective on how animation is usually seen by an average Pole, let's take a step back into more familiar territory and discuss how manga had its underwhelming debut in the land of winged hussars and pierogi. While most people nowadays consume mostly anime, it does not mean that manga did not have its share of influence on people. Manga had its debut in Poland around 1996. The first studio to attempt at translating full manga books for a Polish audience, one that is currently the flagship editor for manga in Poland, was Japonica Polonica Fantastica, or JPF. The company was established by a native Japanese, Shin Yasuda, who originally came to Poland on a trip with the intent of learning Polish. As a linguistic exercise, he attempted to translate a certain manga into Polish, and upon realizing that he had what was essentially the first manga edited for a local audience, he felt it would be a waste not to publish it. His first release was the manga Ten no Hatemade. This was a strategically sound choice, as the manga is loosely based on the life of Poland's last legitimate ruler, Duke Józef Poniatowski. Imagine how surreal it was to discover that this thing exists. It's like going on vacation to Korea and finding out they have a manhwa about George Custer. This, however, was not enough to put the company on the map, but it was just a matter of time. Their second and arguably most notable project was, of course, Sailor Moon. Yes, I know I have talked about Sailor Moon extensively in a previous video, but there is a reason for it. Sailor Moon was a trailblazer for the medium. It was the first manga to catch on in Poland, as well as the first anime to really catch on. You can't claim that there's too much Sailor Moon in this story when you take into account how much of it was made by Sailor Moon. The first full tome of the manga was released in 1997. At the time, the company still consisted of just one person. Since Mr. Yasuda was Japanese and didn't have a perfect understanding of written Polish, very weird typos would sometimes appear in the first edition of Sailor Moon. The series was suspended around 18 volumes in, as it wasn't profitable enough at the time. Around 2006, however, the company began expanding and multiple translators were being employed. The company also obtained the rights to localize some of the most recognizable mangas in the world: Dragon Ball, One Piece, Akira, Slayers, Naruto, Fullmetal Alchemist, the list goes on. No joke, I looked up their website for research on this episode, and they recently began localizing JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. They know which trends to follow. I'd even say, the first mangas I ever read were released and translated by this studio. I started with One Piece, giving up on volume 32 because the plot was getting too dense for me. Also, I cannot show you any of the books as I left them back in Poland when my family was moving. If you're lucky enough, your library might just hold my collection of One Piece or Dr. Slump. Eventually, and unsurprisingly, JPF became the biggest manga localization studio in Poland, beating other, more independent juggernauts such as Vaneko. However, some of you might be connecting some dots together and starting to wonder, how big exactly is the market for manga in Poland? The answer, it's not very big. Not only are these books pricey and niche, comic books are not a very popular medium in the first place, so just because there are people who do read manga, even in great quantities, do not think that this is automatically a sign of a medium being commonly accepted. If you were to ask an average person on the street if they like manga, chances are they wouldn't know what you're asking about. And the second biggest probability is that they would say, "Nah, that stuff is stupid." And if you were to ask a middle-aged person, you might even hear, "That stuff is for children." At some point, one has to acknowledge the cultural differences between Poland and Japan, as well as the generation gap between consumers. We will go into that later, but for now I feel like I have to introduce a certain idea. Because while you might think of manga, you might think of this, or this, or this. But your parents, who learned about the existence of anime differently than you, might hear the word manga and think of this, or this, or this, or... Holy shit. We will talk about the full effects of this difference of mindsets later on, but know that the way a medium is introduced and developed in a certain culture will inevitably have a strong effect on how it is perceived years after that. But now, back to the topic of printed manga. You might recall that I mentioned one studio besides JPF, Vaneko. Vaneko was, for a rather long time, the flagship editor of manga in Poland, yet they were eventually outclassed by JPF. The simple reason was, Vaneko, at the time, was mostly releasing mangas that were very popular and well regarded in Japan, but not necessarily abroad. You might consider them underdogs in that regard, but the reality of it is somewhat different. The reason Waneko was eventually pushed to the sideline was because they were mostly occupied with slice-of-life mangas, as those have always been the most popular in Japan. But in the West, slice-of-life dramas are not likely to be presented in the form of a graphic novel. Graphic novels and comic books have mostly been used for works of action and science fiction, and the expectations for that medium developed differently than they did in Japan. While it is normal in Japan to purchase a full graphic novel, knowing very well that it's a comedy about a guy crushing on his classmate, or a drama about an antisocial girl struggling with being unpopular, these concepts are simply underwhelming to a Western consumer. Those are stories based in emotion and grounded in reality. Why would they be presented in a form that has such a strong emphasis on stylized visuals? A Western consumer would rather buy a comic book with the expectations of spectacular fights, fast-paced action, and certain fictional elements that would simply be impossible in the real world. If you are confused by this duality, that's probably because you've grown accustomed to expecting a Japanese top seller to be a romantic comedy with a title that summarizes the premise for you, but this wasn't the case for your parents, or even most of your friends, or 70% of your country. They grew up with a different media, most likely made by their own country for people living in that country, with certain cultural sensibilities in mind. This detail is so important for the point of this video, and because Poland has such a distinct culture, and is not a cosmopolitan one. And when manga was introduced there, it was rejected by the vast majority of the people there, simply because it wasn't made with certain cultural sensibilities in mind. Your grandma might have looked at the Sailor Moon comic and, assuming she got over the issue of reading from the right side, she would have been disgusted by the sex appeal of the schoolgirl uniforms, the bombastic poses, the violence, the weird, unorthodox style, the exaggerated emotions, the multitude of androgynous-looking men, or, especially, the homoerotic subtexts. I remember asking my grandmother once about her opinions on Sailor Moon, and being surprised at the sheer dislike she got for the series. While on a certain level I could understand that she probably expected a kids show and thought of it as violent, unsuitable for children, what surprised me the most was her anger at portraying women committing acts of violence, as if it was specifically a male domain. It could easily be said that manga didn't have a fair chance of surviving on the Polish market, due to it being a weird novelty and an expensive one at that. There wasn't really a way of promoting it in Poland, and due to the cultural attitudes towards such media, there wasn't a proper demographic for it. But it's still around, and can be attributed to two things: the internet and television. Starting around the time animation started being dubbed. Shit, give me a second. Certain seasons of the Flintstones are credited as a product of... There's some asshole driving really loudly outside my window. What the hell is going on out there?